ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our 7th week here on our 2025 Chronological Bible-in-a-Year Reading Challenge. If you're watching these videos live and following on this journey with us as we go, well, we're heading into mid-March. We've just had a lot of rain here on the eastern seaboard of Australia, and so the sun's out today. I thought I need to have the opportunity to get outside as much as I can, being cooped up indoors all last weekend. Well, this week we are heading into our 7th week of readings, but before I look at today's tutorial, I thought it'd be a good opportunity to take a bit of a step back, okay, a bit of a breath, and review where we are at in the story thus far. That's the whole idea of this challenge, or one of the main ideas of this challenge, is to help us get a big picture view of the Bible story. The idea of these tutorials is not to give you theological insights necessarily, but more so to help you to step back and appreciate the story as we go. All right, so essentially we've read through Genesis, Exodus, and this week finishing off Leviticus, those first 3 books of the Torah, first 3 books of the books of Moses, okay? Genesis is essentially the origin story of God's people primarily, showing the link between Adam through to Abram and then all the way through to Egypt with Joseph. How did we get into Egypt? Exodus is the exit story. God calls Moses after a 400-year narrative gap, okay? God calls Moses to get God's people out of Egypt and to bring them to himself at a mountain called Sinai, where he enters into a new relationship with them. And Leviticus, that we're finishing off this week, is not an origin story or an exit story. It's basically a how-to story, okay? It's a how-to manual describing this new relationship that God's people have with him at Mount Sinai, and how they are to now worship and approach him in this new relationship. Okay, so basically another way to look at the progression of the story so far is like this. What began as the story of one man walking with God, Adam, Enoch, Noah, Abram, one man walking with God, then became the story of one family, Abram, Isaac and Jacob and the boys. One man became one family. Well, that one family has now become one nation. Under Moses at Mount Sinai, a new creation, a new nation has been born there at Mount Sinai. That nation has 13 tribes of Israel, out of which come branches, clans, and families. And God has a very vested interest in this nation. Not only does he want what's best for them, they are, after all, the children of Abraham that God promised he would bless, but he also wants them to represent him well. And so time and time again, as we've been reading Leviticus last week and now into this week, we're going to see this phrase, be like me, be like your God. I am holy, so now I want you to be holy, because I want you to represent me to the nations of the world as image bearers, if you like, of the divine. Okay, so that's a bit of a summary about where we're at so far. One man became one family, has now become one nation. Well, this week, our Sabbath week, no, it doesn't mean you can't read anything this week, don't take a rest, keep going. This week, our 7th week, we are finishing off the book of Leviticus, reading the first 14 chapters of Numbers, and also throwing in a psalm at the end of the week, Psalm 90, which apparently was written by Moses in this time. If you want to see how I suggest to divide the readings, then have a look in the notes underneath these comments, okay? Here we go. 3 things I want you to pay attention to as we head into the end of Leviticus and the start of Numbers this week. Firstly, a calendar. Secondly, a consequence or consequences of disobeying the covenant. And thirdly, accounting. A calendar, consequences, and accounting of God's people. Here we go. All right, ready? First of all, a calendar for public worship. All right, Leviticus 23, and one of the reasons I wanted our readings to start in chapter 23 this week is because it clearly sets out the worship calendar of God's people, and guess what? In chronological order. It lists 7 of the annual feasts of Israel. Now, we've already, in the book of Leviticus and in Exodus, have read about the Sabbaths, okay? 1 day a week, 1 year every 7 years, every 49 years as well. There's this Sabbath period of rest. But it's here in Leviticus 23 where a calendar of annual feasts is laid out for us. And there's ultimately 7 of them, okay? There's 4 in the springtime feast, so Passover and unleavened bread, first fruits, which is basically the Sunday during unleavened bread, and then 50 days later or 7 weeks later, the Festival of Weeks. So there's 4 in the spring, and then there's a bit of a drought through the summer, and at the end of summer there are 3 more trumpets, atonement, and tabernacles. And essentially those 7 annual feasts basically serve like public holidays, okay? God's people already have Sabbath, they already have a day off, a holiday day, but these days are basically your public holidays. They're often referred to, or they're later referred to, as high Sabbaths. So they're Sabbath days, but they're not Saturdays, they are public holidays, they are annual festivals. And it's really interesting, in Leviticus 23, when these are introduced to us, they are called appointed feasts, or in some translations they're called appointed times. And the Hebrew for that word, if you click on it in your computer program, takes you right back to day 4 of creation in Genesis chapter 1, where God says he puts the sun, moon, and stars in the sky to serve as signs of the appointed feasts, okay? Signs of the appointed times. God's people operated on a lunar calendar. They would know when the first day of their month was according to the moon. So the celestial beings served as signs of these festivals. God speaks that right back there in Genesis chapter 1. The other fascinating thing when these feasts are announced to us is that they're referred to as sacred assemblies or holy convocations. And the Hebrew word there literally means not only an assembly, but also a rehearsal or a reading. There was something to be done during these festivals. They weren't just getting together. There was something to be done that was rehearsing something for the future. Well, as we know here on this side of the cross, okay, on this side of the New Testament, we know that what they were rehearsing was for the coming of Jesus, who in Colossians chapter 2, Paul would say those ancient festivals, those holy days, those Sabbaths were all just a shadow of the substance that Jesus himself fulfilled. There you go. Well, these tutorials aren't to give you that kind of theology, but what they are here to do, and all I'll say is this: pay attention to that chapter, pay attention to those festivals, because as we continue to read the scripture, Old Testament and New, we're going to see these festivals mentioned over and over again. Leviticus 23, great place to start. So that's the first thing I want you to take notice of, a calendar for worship as God's community. The second thing to really pay attention to this week is covenant consequences. Okay, a calendar. Number 2, covenant consequences. And a key chapter to this is in Leviticus 26, and then later we see it demonstrated in the book of Numbers, chapter 10, 11, and 12, and 13, when God's people start disobeying him. Chapter 14 particularly, God's people disobey and he curses them. Well, this is promised to us in this covenant. In Leviticus 26, God lays out in very plain language the if-then nature of this covenant that he has entered in with them at Mount Sinai. If you obey, then I will bless you. If you disobey, then I will curse you. In fact, he says here in Leviticus 26, basically, I will treat you just as I treated Egypt. If you disobey and you keep disobeying me, not only would I treat you like I did to Egypt, I will punish you 7 times over if you are unrepentant. All right, now this is a major deal, guys. This covenant that we have read, this that was entered into at Mount Sinai, because that's where we are still, okay? We're still chronologically based here at the mountain of Sinai. God is saying to his people in no uncertain terms, you must obey every command I give you. So I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, we can muck around as much as we like, dividing up the criminal law with the civil law, with the ritual law, with the moral law, with the festival laws, okay? At the end of the day, none of that matters from a covenant perspective. This covenant that they have, this relationship with God that they have, is all or nothing. If you don't obey all of it, you're very much at risk of me coming out and cursing you for your disloyalty to my covenant. All right, that is spelled out very plainly this week. I want you to take notice of that, Leviticus 26, and then we see it demonstrated at the end of our readings in Numbers 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14, when God's people refuse to go into the promised land, when they grumble, they whine, they complain about the manna and the food that they are given and being thirsty for water, okay? They're demonstrating this lack of gratitude towards God, and over again, he punishes them for that. He didn't do that on the other side of the mountain. He didn't treat them like that when they were in Egypt, but he's treating them like that now, the very same way he punished them for the golden calf incident. So now, a year later, or after building the tabernacle, 10 months later, over and over again, they disobey and God begins to curse them. I want you to pay attention to that. It is the consequence of disobeying covenant. It's a massive change in their relationship with God. All right, calendar for worship. Consequences of covenant disloyalty. And the third thing I want you to pay attention to, a sort of a significant thing this week, is accounting, okay? The reason we call the book of Numbers the book of Numbers is because there's a lot of counting in it. They're counting the people that have come out of Egypt. And the reason that they're counting them is for conscription, for camping, and for care of the tabernacle. They're all C's, I can't help it, okay? Conscription for the army, camping around the tent, and taking care of the tabernacle. Well, as we come into the book of Numbers, basically it opens with a census. Moses counts the people, or at least the fighting men, those 20 years of age and over. And first, the reason he does that is because he wants to conscript them for the army. Well, at least for 12 out of the 13 tribes. Okay, there's one tribe that's not included in the army census. Okay, one tribe that has another purpose that does not involve the military. We'll look at them in a moment. But basically, he does a count of the fighting men so they can serve in the army. And that's just a good thing to note. As we keep reading now the story of God's people moving toward the promised land and into the promised land, we are to picture them, among other things, as a military force. Okay, they are an army. They're an army of people marching on toward the promised land. The second reason he does accounting is to organise their camping arrangements. Basically, the sanctuary, when they were to camp at a place, was to be erected, and 12 of the 13 tribes were to be placed 3 on the north, 3 on the south, 3 on the east, and 3 on the west, around the outskirts of the camp. That's the 12 fighting tribes. But the one tribe, the Levites, were to be camped right around the sanctuary in the middle of the camp. And if you go right back to the book of Exodus, you'll realise that Levi had 3 sons. They're mentioned this week, so pay attention to this. Levi, Abraham, Jacob's son Levi, had 3 sons. One of them was to camp at the west, one of them was to camp at the north, and one of them, the clans, was to camp in the south. Okay. Well, guess what? Moses and Aaron come from one of these tribes, and their sons only were the ones called to serve as priests, Aaron's sons, and they are to park themselves right at the east at the entry to the tent. So the tent is covered on 4 sides by the 3 sons of Levi and then by the sons of Aaron and Moses. You see, sometimes I think we get mixed up that we think all Levites are priests. Well, no, that's not the case. That's not the case. Not all Levites are priests. Levites come only from Aaron, and Aaron came from one of those 3 original sons. Okay, so there's accounting of those men for their camping arrangements. But there's also accounting because of the care of the tabernacle. The Levites were to take care of the tabernacle, they were to carry it as they marched onwards, and it was the priests only, as I said, that were to handle the sacred items. You're also going to read that this week. Okay, so there you go. A bit of a hint on that as well for Aaron. Many of you will find familiarity in chapter 6 of Numbers when you come across the blessing of Aaron over the people, the priestly blessing. May the Lord bless you, keep you, make his face shine upon you. Got really popular over COVID, basically. Okay, you might remember that. So some familiarity there. Well, when you finish your readings this week, I then want you to head over to Psalm 90. Legend has it, Psalm 90 was written by Moses when God told them that they were not going to enter the promised land and they had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. We might have another look at that maybe next week as we have a bit of a closer look at the book of Numbers. All right, so keep your eyes out for those 3 things, guys. A calendar for worship, covenant consequences. It's a serious deal that'll set the tone for the whole rest of the Old Testament particularly. And then the counting of God's people as we head into the book of Numbers, as they camp, as they march, and as they march as an army, and as they care for God's tabernacle. Enjoy your readings, and I'll catch you next week for week 8. All right, bye.